Hey everybody, welcome to Always Bored, Never Boring. If you have hung around my channel for any length of time, you have probably heard me talk about Rangers of Shadow Deep, which is a really excellent tabletop skirmish, role-playing game, narrative campaign hybrid game for solo and cooperative play. I really enjoy it, but there is a perceived barrier to entry. This is a tabletop miniatures game, but there's no starter set or anything for it. There is just this really rather lovely book, and it really does benefit from having access to a large collection of miniatures and tabletop terrain to really create an immersive game in the style that the designer envisioned. And I say this is a perceived barrier to entry for two reasons. First of all, you don't really need miniatures to play the game. Obviously, you get the most immersive and beautiful looking game if you do have miniatures, but you can actually play with meeples, wooden counters, coins, beads. When it comes to terrain, you could draw out a map on a flip map from a role-playing game, or you could just cut out pieces of paper. You could use boards from adventure games, for example, if you need some houses to put down on the tabletop, if you've got access to something like Warhammer Quest, which has nice rectangular room tiles, you could put those down and say those represent houses. There's lots of ways you can get around it. The other reason that it is a perceived barrier to entry in my mind is because actually collecting the miniatures and building the terrain and establishing that world on your own tabletop is actually part of the game for me. It's part of the enjoyment of it. There's something quite special about looking at a map in the scenarios that are included in this book and then recreating them, going, oh, okay, I don't have that type of terrain, so I'm going to make it, or I'm going to go online, I'm going to find a company that makes it, then I'm going to buy one and paint one up. When it comes to needing specific types of miniatures, you might not have them in your collection, but you can then go and source them, and then you've got an interesting little painting project. You may end up painting a few zombies, and then a few rats, and then a few gnolls, and then some hero characters, and you get lots of exciting little mini projects that gradually build up into something more cohesive, and I find that much more interesting than, for example, painting up a big 40k army. I like that idea of I can paint this up and then I'll move on to something completely different. I can paint an enemy today, a hero tomorrow. So for me, that's all part of the fun. But it is ultimately something that might put people off. They might say, well, I don't have a big stock of miniatures. I don't have these things. I'm a bit nervous about buying a game that really kind of asks you to have this huge library of content already. So in this video, I thought I would take a very quick look at the bare minimum things that you would need to get started in this game. Obviously, the first thing you need is a ranger miniature. And throughout the book itself, rangers tend to be depicted in this manner. They are like your Dungeons and Dragons rangers. They are the Aragorn character, or perhaps something like a Witcher. They are the people who live on the fringes of society and spend a lot of time out in the wilderness hunting down demons and monsters. They are usually depicted with the travelling cloaks and the hoods, swords, bows and arrows. But the game is a little bit loose with its lore, and also it doesn't really go into races at all. So when it comes to picking a miniature for your ranger, you can really do whatever you want. You could go for that traditional ranger look, or in my particular case, I'm currently building a warband around a Ronin. And because there are no particular rules about races, you can choose to be a dwarf or an elf or a human or a half-orc or whatever you want to be, really. The instructions for creating your character are open enough that you can create something that plays the way you want it to play. So if you want to be a dwarf ranger, you can pick a dwarf ranger and then you can build a character with stats that reflect what you think a dwarf would have. So you may go with lots of high armor and high resilience, or you may want to go for an elf character and then you might decide to bump up stats like your ability to shoot with bows and arrows. Those options are all available, and it means you've got complete freedom really to create a hero that perfectly reflects what you want to bring to the tabletop. But of course, even these rangers are not foolish enough to go into the Shadow Deep by themselves. You will normally have a number of companions with you on your quests who are allies that are there to fill out particular roles and skill sets that your ranger doesn't actually have. So if you've gone for a melee fighter, you can have some companions that have bows and arrows to bring that to your party. And if you've gone for someone who is all about martial combat and doesn't have any magic abilities, you can bring along a conjurer who has access to spells. And the number of companions you need varies depending on several factors. One is how many people are playing the game, so how many rangers you're bringing to the game, and also how you have built your character. Because each ranger starts out with 100 recruitment points, which are a nebulous value which determines how many people you can purchase to join your party. And if you want to, you can actually invest some of your ranger build points into adding another 30 recruitment points to that base total. And also you can add your leadership value to that total. And as a starting character, your maximum leadership I think is 5. So all told, you can have access to 135 recruitment points at the start of the game. And if you are a solo adventurer, you will have access to all of those recruitment points for building your party. If we look here, we can see that there is a chart that covers up to 4 different players and deals with how the recruitment points you have access to changes based on that. A single player will have access to all of the recruitment points and can actually hire up to 7 companions. 2 players, so bringing 2 rangers to the tabletop, means you have your base recruitment points times 0.5 minus 10, and you can have up to 3 companions each. With 3 players, it's your base recruitment points times 0.3, and you can have 2 companions each. And then if you have 4 players, so 4 rangers, which is quite a lot of muscle on the tabletop in one go, you just get your base recruitment points times 0.1, and you can only have 1 companion each. So when you're figuring out what kind of miniatures you need, it's a good idea to think how you're going to be playing it. If you're going to be playing mainly solo, you may need up to 7 companions to get you started. And if you don't have any miniatures at all, I think a good place to probably start for building your warband would be the Frostgrave plastic boxes. There's a box of soldiers for Frostgrave, which is another game from the same designer. And those are very customizable. They've got lots of different weapon options on them. So you should be able to build something from that box that kind of reflects what you bring to the table. But exactly what can you bring to the table? This idea of points doesn't mean anything if we don't know exactly what you can buy with them. So let's take a look at that. In the book, there is a list of companions with their recruitment points. So you can have an Arcanist for 15 recruitment points. They have just a hand weapon, but they know ancient lore and can read runes. You can take an Archer for 20 recruitment points with either a bow or a crossbow. You can have Barbarians, which have hand weapons and shields. They're just extra strong. They get a buff to their strength, and they are 35 recruitment points. You can bring a Conjurer. They are 20 recruitment points as standard, and they just have a staff or a hand weapon and access to 2 spells. If you would like them to have access to a 3rd spell, they are 30 recruitment points each instead. You can bring a Guardsman, which is a soldier of the kingdom trained with 2-handed weapons and light armor. They are 20 recruitment points. There is a selection of different types of hounds. There's a hound for 5 points, or a warhound or a bloodhound for 10 points each. There are knights, which carry hand weapons, shields and heavy armor, and they are 35 recruitment points. There is a man-at-arms option, which is hand weapons, shields and light armor for 20 recruitment points. There are raptors, which are actually birds, and they have a value of 10. There are basic recruits, which are just 10 recruitment points, and they just have a hand weapon. There are rogues, which are 20 recruitment points, and they are useful if your character is more of a fighter, because they can get bonuses on their climbing, perception, picking locks, disarming traps, and being generally stealthy. There are savages, which are barbarians but with 2-handed weapons, and they are 35 recruitment points. There are swordsmen, They are valued at 25 recruitment points, and they have hand weapons and light armor. There are Templars, who are big knights with two-handed weapons and heavy armor, and they're 35 recruitment points. And then there are Trackers, who can fill that role if you haven't invested in a ranger who has a lot of tracking abilities, and they are 30 recruitment points, and they come with bows and staves and the ability to track in the wilderness. So there are lots of different options for building your warband, and lots of things to consider. You can go for a small party of much stronger characters. The warband I'm building at the moment is going to have just 4 characters in it besides the ranger. Or you can go for a larger party, but you're going to have more basic recruits. So you can have almost like an army. But you can work your narrative into that. For example, you might decide to have 7 companions who are all just basic recruits, and you could say that the king has allowed you to take convicts from the dungeon, and they've been given this last chance. They can go on a dangerous mission, or they can face the hangman's noose. Or you could go with just a couple of companions who are really strong and represent the finest knights in the kingdom who are going to make sure you get the job done right. Those options are available to create the narrative that you want. But generally, for your first warband, you're going to need a ranger and up to 7 miniatures. Although it is also worth noting that between missions, you can swap out your companions. You don't have to stick with the same ones all the time. I do. I like the idea of forging a little warband and sticking with them and watching them grow, and sometimes having them thrown into situations where they aren't the best people for the job. They are not the ones that you would normally pick. For example, there might be a scenario where it would be really beneficial to have lots of archers, but I don't have any archers in my warband, and that sort of thing I think is interesting, and it just adds to the overall narrative. Of course, once you have your warband, you need some enemies for your warband to fight. That's the next type of miniatures you need to look at. And there are lots of scenarios in this book, and each scenario calls for different enemies. But just as an introduction, just as a way to sort of get started, I thought I would look at just the first mission. The campaign is broken into missions, with each mission broken down further into scenarios. And at the start of each mission, it will list recommended miniatures and a minimum quantity to have a fun experience. For example, for mission 1, which comprises 2 different scenarios, you need a minimum of 6 zombies, 3 giant rats, 6 giant spiders, and 3 survivors, who are basically unarmed humans. And again, you could choose to use counters or tokens instead of the miniatures. Furthermore, you could proxy in different things. For example, there is a later scenario which requires gnolls. I don't have any gnolls, so I subbed in orcs. But for the very first scenario in the game, you don't even need all of the things listed here. You actually just need zombies and rats. If we turn the page and look at the first scenario, you can see that there is a map layout here, and it shows starting positions for 4 zombies and 2 giant rats, and there are opportunities for additional zombies and rats to turn up. But for this particular scenario, that's all you're facing. In the second scenario, it introduces the giant spiders. The setup map here is more of a recommendation than a strict guideline you have to follow, but it says it's a 3x3 area, and they recommend 4 or 5 small buildings in the center of the board. And it's useful if you can get buildings where the tops come off, because you can go inside the buildings. I have done videos on my channel of some very nice pre-painted buildings which go together very easily with PVA glue, and you can take the tops off, and they work really well for this type of thing. Besides the houses, there is just basically almost scatter terrain really, but it's trees, outcrops of rocks, little ruins, tumble down cottages, whatever you want really, just to create some terrain that blocks line of sight and gives the monsters something to creep through as they come to get you. There is a river up here, but you can quite happily leave that out, and I don't think it changes this scenario particularly whether you have that or not. The only other thing you really need are clue tokens. You will need 6 clue tokens, and in a previous video I showed some 25mm Renedra bases, which are incredibly cheap on eBay and really good for making things like clue tokens, because you can just spray paint them, paint a red cross on them or something, or even a question mark, and go a little bit Riddler with them. And then you've got something you can put on the tabletop and say, that represents an objective. And it doesn't matter that they're quite generic, because what those clues represent and where they are in the environment changes from scenario to scenario. So in one scenario, your clue tokens might be spider cocoons, but in another one they might be, there's a chance they might be a corpse, or they might be a treasure chest, and you don't really know what it is until you actually investigate the spot. And that's it really, that's everything you need for the first scenario. If you would like to take a quick look at the second scenario, we can turn the page, and we can see that it is on a smaller 2.5 by 2.5 table, and you mainly have just trees, because you are in a forest with giant spiders. And again, there's no necessity to accurately recreate that map. You can work with what you've got. And also, I think this game really does breed ingenuity. It encourages you to think outside the box a little bit. It encourages you to have a go at maybe making some types of terrain you wouldn't normally make, or having a go at something new, painting up something you haven't painted before, or finding ways to get around things. Oh, I need a hill, but I don't have a hill. I'll put a piece of green fabric over a couple of books. That sort of creativity to get an approximation of what they have in the scenario map on your tabletop. And I think it's quite compelling, and it's quite satisfying to see what you can do with your table and how you can recreate these scenes. And in terms of miniatures and terrain, that's pretty much it to get you going. Obviously, each new scenario introduces new types of terrain and new types of enemy, and new challenges to overcome as you build your collection of miniatures or find proxies and alternatives. Besides the things listed, really the only other things you'll need a tape measure for measuring distances, you'll need some D20s for the combats and the test resolutions, and you will need a deck of playing cards. And it can be just a basic standard deck, but I actually have this Age of Dragons deck with artwork by Anne Stokes. I specifically asked for this card deck for use with Rangers of Shadowdeep because I thought it would be nice to have some fantasy artwork on the cards I was using. The cards are specifically used in-game for generating events. Because this is a solo or co-op game, you don't have a dungeon master. So each round you're drawing from a deck, and depending on what suit or colour you draw will determine what kind of events you have encountered. So it's nice to have a deck with some nice fantasy artwork, but as I say, you can use any basic deck you have, as long as it's a full suit, so you have something to work with. But you will need cards. Interestingly, I was contacted by the publisher the other day because they are thinking of producing some different decks of cards for Rangers of Shadowdeep. They were looking at different options, such as cards with all the stats for the enemies, cards with all the stats for different weapons and magical items, cards for searching the clue tokens, I think it was, in the various different scenarios that are currently available. And one of the options was actually a special deck of playing cards with Rangers of Shadowdeep artwork, which would be nice, but I am actually quite happy with these options. I think I personally voted for a deck of cards with all of the stats for the monsters because it's just convenient to have a few cards out on the table with the stats easily accessible rather than flicking through the pages of the book which has stats for monsters for multiple missions. So that was my preference. Like I say, I'm quite happy with my dragon deck. But any pound store deck of cards will do. And that's it, really. That's everything you need to get started. And it does sound like quite a lot, and I guess it is, but there are ways around things with proxies and using counters and tokens instead of miniatures. drawing your maps on flip mats or on big sheets of craft paper. There are ways to get around these things. And as I mentioned before, I do think the challenge of fulfilling the criteria of the different scenarios is part of the joy of the game. It's one of the things I really like doing is looking at a list of miniatures and going, oh, I don't have one of those, and then hunting one down on eBay or on one of the stores that I use regularly, and adding it to my collection and having something different to paint. There's a lot to enjoy there, and there's certainly a lot to enjoy in this book. I am very much enjoying Rages of Shadow Deep, and I'm hoping to do a bit more coverage of it on the channel. I may at some point do a video showing you my finished Warband, which is quite an unusual one. I've gone for something which is much more story driven rather than something that I think is going to be an effective fighting force. But I guess until then, that's it from me for now. I hope somebody has found this video useful. If you have liked it, please consider pressing the like button. If you have really liked it, please consider subscribing if you don't already do so. And hopefully, I will see you all again very soon. Bye bye everyone. Bye bye.